Now we're going to begin with the procedure. So we take our gauze, spread it in the warm water, and then dip in it inside that warm water. We bring the amount of compound we need. I'm going to begin with the lower impression compound, and I'm going to put in 1 cake to heat in. Once it becomes warm enough, you can notice that it can change in form. And this is the way it sets. So it's a thermal reaction where it becomes soft, and once it cools, it goes back to become hard. And this is the function of the wax components inside this impression compound. You also have a filler to make sure that the waxes don't flow too much and become liquid. We still need the form of it. So that's the function of the filler. So now you notice that it had become soft. I can knead it using inside like a dough. I can manipulate it with my fingers. Okay. You can see if it becomes sticky, that means the temperature of the water needs to be lowered. You knead it into the form of a ball, and you make sure that it's heated evenly. So even that the surface is a bit sticky now, the inside of it is still hard. That means I need to soak it once more and make it all the way soft with the consistency that is uniform. Now that you have selected your trays, we're going to begin with taking the procedure for taking impression. The procedure for taking impression includes the selection of the tray, which you have already done, checking the size of the trays on your case, so it's the selection of the size, then the selection of the retention form. You might need a specific retention form for each impression material. So let's go through the procedure for compound. So you have your patient ready, you have your metal trays ready, you have the compound cake ready. And you will also need warm water. This warm water should be around 45 to 55 degrees. And in a simpler way, if you have gloved hands and you put your finger in that temperature, you can stand the temperature. It is hot a bit, but it's standable. You can tolerate the temperature on your finger while it's gloved. And that's the temperature suitable for compound. And finally, you should have a gauze to put in the water, because once compound is heated, it becomes flowable and sticky. And that's a feature of the presence of wax in it, one of its components. It becomes sticky. So you don't want the compound to become sticky around the rubber bowl. So we just line it with the gauze, we dip in it in the water, and then we place the impression compound inside that warm water to heat it. If you are taking an upper impression, please select a cake and a half. If you're doing the lower impression, just use 1 cake, please. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to talk about the procedure for making primary impressions. This procedure is done at clinic number 1 for a patient that has been approved for denture therapy. So we're going to talk about impression selection, tray selection, the procedure for each impression material, followed by the disinfection method and writing the laboratory form. So let us begin first of all by selecting the impression material. There are 2 materials approved for denture primary impressions for a patient that has a regular edentulous ridge with no big problems, and we have the options between compound and alginate. There are some specific indications where I need to shift to alginate, and these are written in your theoretical material. So that's first we have to select the material, then we select the trays. The trays we have can be categorized by their material, either made of metal or alloy or made of plastic. It could be selected by the form of the tray. If it was for edentulous, meaning it has a cross section that is circular, and that usually fits an edentulous patient that usually has this cross section, circular section, for the edentulous ridge. While we have some trays specific for dentate patients where teeth are present, so to accommodate the space for the teeth, we need the tray to be vertically high with a deep sulcus around, because the vertical height between the occlusal surface and the sulcus is large if we compare it with the edentulous patient. So for this case, as a dentate patient, we select dentate trays, and these are determined by the cross-section of their morphology. So they have the square morphology with a deep sulcus. We have problems if we take impressions for edentulous patients using these trays. We will have the following problems. For example, this is an edentulous case taken with a dentate tray. You can notice that we will have problems with the sulcus depth. It will be beyond the sulcus depth. That will traumatize the patient. You will have uneven thickness on the left and the right, and you will have also some vertical height that is large, and that will take a lot of impression material. So it's better to take a good impression to utilize the correct tray for the correct case. Okay? And we will not have those problems once we select this tray, which has this half circular shape for its cross section. Trays are also, so we're not going to select these. And we're going to select the trays that are suitable for edentulous patients. Can you please now raise and go to the distribution table to select your impression material and the trays. For each group, just for a moment to say, each group will have two casts, one upper, one lower. You are going to select an impression for the upper and an impression for the lower of different material. So you will be getting the impression material of both types. Each group, composed of 5 students, will have the casts with them, and they will select one metal tray, one plastic tray for alginate. Make sure that these are opposite. So if you select the upper metal tray, select with it a lower plastic tray, and so on, to make sure that you are exposed to both cases with the different material. Now that we have washed the impressions after the disinfection, we need to transport these impressions to the lab in the most accurate form possible. We don't want them bumping into stuff. We want them stable, in place. And we also want them labeled correctly, because we don't want them mixed up with other patients' work at the lab, because the lab takes impressions from multiple sources. They will have a huge number of impressions there. So we need to transport them. Alginate and compound are both sensitive in times of time. If we send this in a long time, it might distort by losing some of the remnant of the heat inside. So it might distort. This material is moisture sensitive, and we want to pour it as soon as possible. So the transport time for both materials should be less than 15 to 20 minutes. Within the first half hour, maximum an hour, these should be poured into cast material. To transport alginate material, we need a sealed bag. So we place the material inside the bag. But still, it might dry out because it's kept for a while in this dry bag. So to maintain the moisture, we use a napkin that is dampened with water. It's not dripping, just dampen it with water. And this will provide a source of humidity enough to keep the impression accurate. So we load the impression for this patient, for example. We hold it in a secure way. And then we need to place it in a solid container. Why in a solid container? Because while transport, if this was in a car or within stuff, other stuff, it might be crushed. If it's crushed, the dimensions of the impression are no longer accurate. We need a solid box to transform them. And then we are going to label the name of the patient, the date of the impression, the source, if it was clinic of Dr. Mahmoud, for example. We're going to load this information or take a ready label and just stick it on with the patient's name and ID there to make sure that the lab identifies this material and doesn't mix it away. For compound, I could transport it dry or wet, it doesn't matter. I could use a tissue or I could use a sponge, and I load the impression once more in a bag and with the ID of the patient ready, and the material is not squeezed, it's placed in a rested form inside a solid box, and once more it's transformed in the same matter. For the technician who's going to receive this box, he needs to know what he's going to do with it. For the clinic number 1, we need to write down what we call a lab request form. A lab request form tells the technician what to do. These have many forms. We're going to use the simplest, where we're going to write down the name, the date, the patient's name, the student's name, the file number, and some notations about the patient. This is a complete denture case, so we place down the date and the instructions for the technician to form and pour a cast. Also, we will ask them to do what we call a special tray, ready to go to clinic number 2, which will be our next clinic, taking a more accurate impression. So we're going to write down the instructions. Please pour the upper and lower alginate or compound impressions using plaster. The material of choice for primary casts are plaster. We're going to also add, please formulate a special tray or a custom tray, and usually the material used for that are light cure acrylic or cold cure acrylic. Next appointment should be written down for the technician to have his work ready beforehand, and better before 24 hours, to be delivered to the clinic before the next visit, because we want to make sure that the lab work is correct, and if it needs repetition, we have time to send it back. Then you will have the signature of you as the doctor, and if you are under the supervision of a doctor, you will have the signature of your instructor. Please see the form filled in at the demonstration table, and you will see the lab form filled in for lab number 1 to be done. Now please finish in the disinfection of your casts. That's location of make your cast ready for translocation depending on the type of the material, and fill in the laboratory form. And for the patient's label, we are going to substitute it by the student's label. So you're going to place your material inside the box for your group, write in the student names of those attending, and then accompany this box with the lab form request and place it in place, ready for us to mark your work. Thank you. After impressions are ready and taken out from the patient's mouth, they should be washed under running water for around 2 minutes. This will eliminate around 90% of the microbiology adherent to the surface of the impression. And then we need to select the type of disinfection we need. For impression material, we need medium or low disinfectant ability in the form of a spray or a soaking liquid. For compound, it does not get affected by moisture and water, so we can soak the impressions in a disinfectant material. But for alginate, this material is sensitive and it still can absorb water from the humidity from the outside. If we soak it in water, what will happen is that it will suck up this water and it will expand. And this is called syneresis. So this will change the dimensions of this impression. If we keep it in the air to dry out, it will lose the water and it will dry out, and the drying out will also alter its morphology and its dimensions. So we need to disinfect it in a clever way. So we spray the disinfectant on the surface of the impression after the washing step that you have done. And then make sure that it pools into the impression. Then, to make sure that it doesn't keep amounts of liquid inside it, we invert it on a piece of tissue and leave it for 10 minutes soaking. Once the soaking is finished, we need to transport this disinfected impression to the lab. So once more, we have to go through the properties of the material. I have finished the disinfection and I washed away the material. We're going to wash the disinfectant off. Okay. So the method of removal is snap removal. That means we suddenly take off the cast and remove the impression. Okay? Take it out of the patient's mouth. This snap removal increases the strength of alginate so it doesn't tear off. If we have slowly removed it, these areas unsupported will tear off easily. This is an impression of the cast, not the patient's mouth. But if we exclude this area, which is part of the cast, not the patient's mouth, and we notice the impression, we find that the features of a perfect impression are there. The material on the left and the right are equal. The surface is smooth. We have a continuous sulcus. There is a small bubble here and a small bubble here. These can be corrected or repeated. If the bubble is small and it is confined in a small area, I could simply add it while I'm doing the pouring or making the cast. If it is large, we need to repeat that impression. So this is the alginate impression ready. After the impression has set, we make sure that it's totally set. We're using our fingernail test, as we have said. So I take my finger and begin pressing through the impression material with my fingernail. Now it doesn't leave any traces. That means the impression material is set. But for alginate in specific, alginate needs a bit more time. So after this test is positive, meaning that we feel that the impression material is set, we should leave it inside the patient's mouth for an extra minute because it continues the setting reaction slowly. We don't see it, but it's stronger once we remove it, when it's totally set. The method of removal is a snap method. That means we just simply snap it out. Stop. Now for the upper, we're going to begin with 3 measures of water and 3 scoops of powder. Okay. Once we begin adding the powder to the liquid, we have to be quick. 1, squeeze it, flatten it, and add it. 2, and then 3 scoops. These are ready for you. We're going to incorporate the powder into the liquid first. Then we have an initial dough. It's unevenly mixed. We begin squeezing this dough to the sides of the rubber bowl, collecting it and then spreading it while squeezing. Figure 8 shape. Collecting it, taking all the powder in, and then squeezing it to the side of the rubber ball. And once it's homogeneous and even in color, I collect the material with my spatula. Notice the color change. This is the type of indicator of the impression material setting. So it's a visual indicator rather than having the chemical time, which we have on the powder. I could take some of the water, smoothen the surface out, and then put it inside the patient's mouth if it was the upper, squeeze it into place, You can find that even here, the amount of material squeezed to the sides is more than the one squeezed from the exterior side because of the post-dam utility wax we added. And we maintain pressure. Now, this is the process of making impressions for upper and lower. Now you are ready for taking the impressions. Please begin with taking the impressions now. Stop. So this is the quick stage where your hand should be very quick. So we first incorporate the powder into the liquid, and then we begin squeezing this to the rubber ball's walls. The squeezing motion is like a figure 8. I keep collecting the material and squeezing it back and forth. And then I collect the material all together and load the lower tray. So this is our tray. We load it from the inside. It's easier. We load the impression material. And please notice that while we're loading it, that the color of the material is changing. I could use a bit of water to smoothen it out as we have smoothened the compound material to make sure no bubbles are there and it's filled in. And then we go to the cast, make sure it's centered, and then begin squeezing the alginate into place. And once more, we maintain the pressure throughout the procedure until the impression material is set. Stop one. Now we will begin with the process of alginate mixing and taking the impression. Alginate comes in the powder form. We need to mix it well before dispensing it, because the powder has heavy particles and light particles. If we take it out from the closet, the mixture will not be even. The heavy particles will be down here. So we need to mix it around and shuffle the powder good well before we begin. Then we open it. We're going to begin with the lower impression. So we have 2 measures of water ready. We're going to place always the liquid is placed before the powder. Okay. Now the powder is in, and then I measure 2 scoops of powder with the water ready, and I even the surface with a spatula, and then I locate it in the powder. This is where I need to work fast because alginate sets fast and I need to mix it well. The first mix is going to be a circular mix. Okay, just incorporating the powder into the liquid, and then I begin squeezing the material to the edges of the rubber ball with an figure 8 manipulation. Okay, and you can see that the material is a bit pink, and this is one of the features of alginate, that it changes colors while mixing. Then I load my tray. Again, to do the lower tray first, sorry. So, note that the material is changing in color. I load my tray evenly on both sides. Stop. Now that the adhesive is ready, we have solved the problem of alginate, that it is not adherent to solid surfaces. Now we need to solve another feature that alginate has. Alginate is a weak material. So if it goes beyond the tray margin, it becomes weak and it could tear off easily. And we're going to see it in the final impression. So after placing the adhesive, we make sure that the tray covers the features of the area that we need to take an impression of. Because these are stock trays, these are not the actual trays for this patient, specific for the patient, many times these trays become short. For the lower, they might become short from the distobuccal angle, or distally, sometimes the ridge is longer. And this is the only tray we have. Its size for the ridge is correct, but its extensions, the length of it is not enough. So we need to make sure that we make it longer. If we take an impression with this case, as it is, the alginate that runs over the border and far away from it might tear off while we are taking out the impression. So we need support for the impression material. This, for the upper, the usual places where we have deficiencies are, once more, the distobuccal angle as in the lower, and sometimes the distal edges if the ridge is longer, the same as the lower. But we have an extra addition for the utility wax is to prevent the alginate from flowing into the throat of the patient. So we might place some of the utility wax on the distal border of the cast. Also, in some patients, we might have a short tray from the anterior, especially in the premaxillary area. So these are the locations that are usually deficient, and these even apply in the dentate case or together with the edentulous. So we're going to place utility wax. Utility wax comes in rope shape, and it has colors. You might find it red, white, or so on. I would take pieces of it and place those pieces using its own tackiness. It is sticky. The utility wax is a bit sticky, and also with the adhesive there, it will stick better. And I reshape the border to become longer. This longer border will support the alginate that goes away from it while taking an impression of a deep sulcus. So in the lower, the usual areas are the buccal shelf area, and the distal area. And once more, we have the lingual pouch area. Remember that in using compound material, we try to aggregate the compound in this area to make sure we take a good lingual pouch. For alginate, we could utilize the utility wax to lengthen this area and make sure that we record it correctly. So these are the locations in the lower. So distal, distobuccal, and lingual pouch areas. For the lower, for the upper now, the usual areas are also in the posterior area. We could add to the buccal pouch area, the distal if it is short, a bit vertically to prevent the material from flowing outside, and go to the other side. So if these areas are short, we just fill them in. And how do I make them, make sure that are they short or not? Inside the patient's mouth, I check the tray before adding my material. I also might need to add in the premaxillary. So these are the areas usually needing more utility wax to take them correctly. We notice now the tray becomes longer. It is adapted more. It covers the features of the impression area better, and this vertical component of the utility wax here will prevent the flow of alginate into the throat of the patient. So in this side, we just make it a bit vertical, like this. Okay. So now we're ready to do our impression. Please now add the utility wax to your trays and be ready for the alginate impression. Stop. You will have the material dispensed in cups. So the measure of the water and the measure of the powder will be ready in cups for you in the lab. But for our purpose, suppose we are at the clinic. So in the clinic we prepare our impression material. It has with it its own dispensing cups and spoon. This spoon is for the powder and the dispensing cup is for the liquid. And each scoop of powder from this spoon corresponds with 1 unit of water here. So if I'm taking an upper impression, I utilize 3 units of water with 3 scoops of powder. If it's for the lower, I use 2 measures of water with 2 scoops of powder. Okay? I will have also my rubber bowl and spatula ready for me. And I'll also have an adhesive spray. For your case, you will find it at the dispensing table in front of the lab. And then I need to select my trays. The trays used for alginate impression are either metal or plastic, but please notice that they are perforated. Alginate material is like a gel. It does not go with solid material. You need it to go inside that solid material, penetrate, and to make these tags, you can see that for this case, it penetrated these holes. It made tags on the outside. This makes it retain to the hard tray material. So if either it was metal or plastic, we use the types that are perforated for our purpose. This retention even sometimes is not enough. So we utilize another type of retention, which is the adhesive spray. An adhesive spray is a type of chemical that makes a tacky chemical that we spray it on the tray and leave to dry. So I'm going to spray from distance on the side of the tray where alginate is going to be applied, and we're going to apply it to the second tray. Now this material needs time to dry off our impression tray. So if I place alginate impression at this stage while it's still liquid and runny, it will act as a separator rather than an adhesive. To become tacky and sticky, you might even hear the sound of my gloves because it's tacky, it needs to dry out. If it's still liquid, if I could take some of this liquid material, still it's like oil. It's not tacky at all. So for it to function, it should be dry. So I need to my trays, after selection of the size, I have selected the size corresponding with these casts that we have. After selection of the size, we spray them and leave them aside to totally dry before continuing our steps. So now, please go to the dispensary table. Make sure you select your trays according to the sizes of the casts you have, and spray the adhesive and be ready for the next step. And now we're going to talk about alginate impression material. To make sure, now for each group you have finished one impression for compound for one of the casts, and you're going to do the opposite cast with alginate. So these 5 minutes from now, you're going to begin to prepare the material for your alginate impression material. You should, together with the gloves, you should also be wearing a face mask because alginate comes in powder. This powder can disperse in the room while you're utilizing it. If you breathe it inside your lungs, it might precipitate inside the lungs. So it is a hazardous material. So make sure that you wear your face mask while manipulating alginate impression material. You are going to go to your demonstrator. He is going to utilize the powder and water for you. You will have 2 cups. Stop one. We're still exposing areas that are hard. Warming it up until it's totally uniformly warm. With Vaseline on your gloves. It's very tacky, as you can notice. Going to rotate it. Now it's ready. So what we're going to do, we are going to put it in a circular form, in a ball shape. And we're going to load the upper tray. For the upper tray to load it, we first place this dough as a ball shape in the palatal part, and then begin squeezing the excess material into place anteriorly. We want the tray surface to be evenly filled. Any creases on the surface, we remove them. Any excess the material on the palate, we make sure that it's pushed away, because this will, if left, will flow into the throat of the patient and increase what we call gagging reflex, meaning that the patient would not tolerate it and begin doing the movement of throwing up. And we don't want this bad side effect for the patient. So we make sure that any excess material on the palatal side is pushed till the end of the tray, while the excess material, once more, we build in what we call the buccal pouch. And it's also the deepest area in the patient's mouth, inside the patient's mouth from the buccal side. So to make sure that the material flows into that area rather than escaping, we take some of the excess material from the sides of the tray and we load it to make this area a bit larger or taller. And then, once we have the surface smooth, I can use my finger just to place a small groove, a very shallow groove. This will help me locate the ridge, because inside the patient's mouth, I'm not sure if I'm to the left or to the right, but the groove will help me. It will be over the ridge. Once I've loaded the tray correctly, I put it back and soak it for a while inside the water to make sure it warms up again. Because sometimes while I'm loading, as I told you, we might have that the surface becomes cold, and this loss of temperature will cause creases in the impression at the final stage. Once it's soaked enough, I make sure it is warm enough, it moves easily, and then if I'm inside the patient's mouth, I come from behind and then place it and relocate it and make sure that the tray handle is beneath the nose. Just to repeat that step on a cast for you to see it. So suppose this is the patient's mouth. I enter with my tray, I locate and I center the tray using the groove I placed. The handle is beneath the nose. Then I enter with 2 fingers, of course this is an upper, I enter with 2 fingers and begin squeezing into place. For you, because it's a cast, we'll just use it on the table. I like to mention it to make sure that you understood that point. See how that when I'm squeezing, the excess material goes in a small amount outside, not from the palatal side if there was some excess there. And also you could see that the excess material also flowed into the area of the buccal pouch area, which is deep in behind the patient. And I make sure that I keep squeezing. If it was inside the patient's mouth using 2 fingers, I keep it in place like this, because if I release pressure on impression material, this applies to all impression material, no matter what the material is. For the impression material to take an accurate and fine details of the surface, it should be squeezed against that surface, because many material while setting, it shrinks a bit or changes a bit. So if I'm not squeezing it, it might shrink away from the tissue and I lose the adaptation and the fine details that it should be taking. So I preserve that all during the setting, or for this case it's not a chemical setting, it's a thermal setting where it cools down. Until it cools down enough, I keep and maintain the pressure using 2 fingers inside the patient's mouth. Once more, you can ask your assistant to bring in the 3-in-1 syringe and begin spraying air on the tray to speed in the cooling of the tray. Once it's set enough, I can test the setting of impression material. First of all, I have to observe the setting time written on the instructions, box for example, or label that the box has. Or I can use my finger by pressing on the impression material. So if my fingernail, I try to press in my fingernail. So if my fingernail leaves a trace, that means the impression material is not set yet. But if it doesn't leave a trace and it's solid enough, I can now take it away. So impression compound becomes solid. It goes back to solid. It's not a flexible material. And this is one of its indications. It can be used with cases, edentulous cases that have no undercut. For the removal, I try to apply snap removal. I hold my cast firmly because of the Vaseline, it's slipping a bit, and I take it away. And now I have an impression of the surface. Okay. Once I've removed the impression, I begin checking with my supervisor, trying to check the adequacy of this impression. For an adequate impression, we should have even amount of material on both sides. It's not flipped to the side from here to here. We have the features of the sulcus continuous. We have the full features of the palate and the rugae area. We have a continuous sulcus around from both sides, continuous sulcus. And we also might have the indentations of buccal inside the impression. So now, those that have finished the lower or upper impressions, now you are ready to go to your instructor and check the quality of the impression with your instructor to make sure that your impression is suitable. Now for the upper impression, we're going to use a cake and a half. We're going to place it with gauze into the warm water. We're going to wait for it to warm up. We're going to prepare our upper cast, make sure it has Vaseline on it, to make sure that you can remove the impression easily. And while it's warming, take it out and keep trying to move it around to make sure that the heat penetrates into the inner sides of the cakes, because impression compound is not a good thermal conductive material. So we need to make sure that the heat goes and infuses into the inside of the impression material. So every now and then, just keep kneading it with your fingers. Exposing the hard material, moving away the soft material, and exposing the hard material to the warm water. Stop. We're going to repeat the impression, but this time using a cast, just to show you the procedure. So I'm in front of the patient, and I insert into the mouth of the patient. I make sure that I am centered over the ridge before squeezing. I make sure by the lateral rotation of the tray, or making sure that this handle is under the nose of the patient. Then with 2 fingers I begin pressing down, squeezing the material into place. Then firmly holding it into place using 2 fingers until it's cool enough to take it out. We're going to wait for it to cool down, and once it's ready, we're just going to snap it off its location. So now you can begin. Those that have a compound material for the lower, you can begin preparing your cast for the impression by putting Vaseline over your cast, selecting the tray for the lower, making sure the water is warm and placing the gauze inside, heating the material, and then loading it into the tray and taking an impression. You are given now 10 minutes to do this task as a group. Your instructors will help you if you need any help, and we're coming back in a moment to see the upper impression with compound. But just to show you, we have given it enough time to cool down, and we are going to see the impression. Stop. Now that I have soaked the material just enough to have it smooth and playable, I put some Vaseline on my gloves, and then I mold it into a shape of a ball. Then Because I'm using this for the lower impression, I make it in this form as an elongated tube. And in this tube, I spread it a bit from the middle, making the bulk of the material on the sides. And then I load the tray with this material. The material itself, I load it into the tray, I press it into place. Excess material that goes out to this side, I reorganize it and repress it into its location. I make it more uniform. I press the material in the middle, making sure it's adapted to the tray. I press the material on the sides. The excess material on the sides, I re-enter it into the tray, locate it inside the tray. I smoothen the surface because an excellent impression should have no creases on it. So there are no crease lines or fold lines coming from the compound. And I also lengthen the compound on the lingual side of it, because usually in the edentulous patient we have what we call the lingual pouch. This lingual pouch is deep on the lingual side, and many times during taking impressions this area is not recorded correctly. So I try to squeeze some of the excess material from the tray into that area to make sure that it's long, it has enough material to record that area. No creases are on board now on the impression. I might just place a small groove with my finger. Just this will easily locate the sulcus while it's inside the patient's mouth. I reheat it, making sure I soak it once more, because during the manipulation with my fingers, the impression material became a bit cool. So I need it to go back to the consistency with the correct temperature. And once now it's correct and it's ready and it is easily manipulated, I place it inside the patient's mouth. So if I'm taking the impression from the inside of the patient's mouth, I send the cheek away by one side and my finger is enlarging the other side, and I go inside to the patient's mouth, and then with me in front of him, I should be in front of him, but for the demo purpose I'm behind him, and I'm in front of him, and then I press firmly on both sides until the material is set. In this case, it's not a chemical reaction. The setting is simply cooling of the tray. My assistant, if my assistant is close by, I ask her to use the air syringe to eject air, cold air, to the tray, and this will make the setting or the cooling of the impression material faster. The impression material, once it cools, it will hold its form and it will take an impression of the patient. So we're making sure that it is warm enough and uniform. And now I'm going to knead it or manipulate it until it becomes like a small ball. For the lower tray, this small ball, I need first of all to lengthen it into a tube form. If I feel that it's still not playable enough, I soak it in the warm water once more to make sure I could manipulate it correctly. بغير gloves. حط شوية فازلين على ايدي لأنه مزعلي